So let's talk a little bit now about means, the tools to commit the crime. Family weapons were used to commit this crime. And this is forensic evidence that was presented to you. First of all, we'll talk about the blackout. And you've heard testimony that there were 2 blackouts purchased in December of 16. And that one went missing around Halloween of 17, years prior to these murders, and that a replacement without a thermal scope was bought in April of 2018. 3 blackouts that the defendant purchased can only account for one of them. And it's this 3rd blackout which is the one that's at issue. You heard from Paul's friend Will Loving. And first of all, let me say this. You heard the defendant in his various statements, and he's very concerned about saying that they didn't have a blackout. There was no blackout along with them, even though he slipped up once and said, yeah, we were out looking for hogs. And you heard from his law partners to do the same thing, saying, yeah, you can look for hogs in the daytime. Very, very concerned early on in the statements and saying they didn't have a blackout, they just had a .22 pistol. And he also said, eventually, he's like, well, I think I replaced it. Well, I guess I replaced it. I'm certain I replaced it if you listen to his various statements. Very vague and fuzzy about this 3rd blackout. And told the friends, Paul's friends, both of whom testified, but Will Loving in particular. And what did Will Loving say? The defendant said the gun went missing around Christmas time of 2020, but Will Loving said, no, I was with Paul. I was with Paul in turkey season, which is in the spring. I was with Paul in turkey season, and we sat out at the steps right outside the house that y'all went to today, right on that side entrance that goes into the gun room. And if you look down, you can see how they were digging a pond and how you could fire down in that area. And they set up some targets to sight it in. And we were shooting that other gun. We were shooting that other gun, that replacement gun. And it had a red dot sight on it. Not a thermal scope, but a red dot. A red dot, which is not good at shooting at night. But they were shooting it and sighting it in with the red dot, the tan gun. He was with Paul while they were shooting that gun right there. And what did Jeff Croft, who testified before you, find right there? Weathered cases, or casings. Weathered cases, right where Will said he and Paul were shooting that gun just a couple months prior to the murders. S&B 147 grain blackout rounds. And those rounds and empty boxes, and the pictures are in evidence, and the rounds are in evidence, were found all over that property. S&B 147 grain blackout. There were full clips found, there were empty boxes found, and there were also cases found, S&B 147 grain blackout rounds found across the street at their shooting house. 2 separate locations on the property, but what's really important, again, goes back to what Will said. I was with Paul when we shot that replacement gun right there. Right there. And you heard forensic scientist Paul Greer testify that the 6 cases, items 2 through 7, the 6 cases found around Maggie that killed her, were loaded into, extracted, and ejected through the same firearm that fired those weathered cases right outside the door where y'all went to today and at the shooting range across the street. family blackout killed Maggie. It was present just a couple months prior to the murders, and it's gone now. It's gone now. A family weapon the defendant cannot account for killed Maggie. But what about the shotgun? The 12-gauge shotgun that was loaded with one federal double-aught buck and one dry-lock #2 steel shot. Well, first of all, you heard that the two weapons that Paul often favored and often carried were this shotgun right here and the blackout. Those were his two guns, his favorite guns, aside from his deer rifle. The defendant had that gun with him when Daniel Green, the first deputy on the scene, showed up. And shotguns, as you heard, are a little bit different than rifles. And the conclusion there was that the two fired shells that were inside the feed room that killed Paul had class characteristics similar with that Benelli, Super Black Eagle 3, but insufficient individual identifying marks to either match or exclude it. That shotgun right there. But what else did you hear about the shotguns? Paul had this Benelli Super Black Eagle 3. That was his gun. Camo print, camo strap. Nolan Tootin, Nathan Tootin, Will Loving, Rogan, all identified that as Paul's gun. It's the one that Alec had. It's got Maggie's DNA and blood on the receiver. You heard from the DNA expert. And it was loaded with 12 gauge and a 16 gauge misloaded round. What else did you hear? You also heard about the Super Black Eagle 2. And you heard from Nolan and Nathan that this was Buster's gun. This is the Super Black Eagle 2 that had the Mojo sticker on it. And that was recovered during SLED's search of the residence the next day. But what else did you hear? You heard from Nathan and Nolan that the defendant's favorite gun was a Super Black Eagle 1. Remember Nathan going through each one of these guns and how knowledgeable he was as to the differences between them? SLED search Moselle for every 12 gauge. No Super Black Eagle 1. Family weapons. Family weapons killed these victims. And on top of that, just like the S&B 147, well, not as much, but they're in evidence, federal double-aught buck and the Winchester dry-lock steel 2-shot rounds were recovered at various locations on the property. What does that mean? We talked about motive, means. The defendant had the means to commit these crimes. At the beginning of the case, I talked to you about some of the evidence that you would hear, and I held up my cell phone. And there's been a lot of that evidence, but the last witness you heard in the state's case in chief was Peter Rudolph, and he went through that timeline. And what does it show? We've gone motive means opportunity. Opportunity to commit the crime. And what does this timeline show? These are all the information, the various sources of information that were in this timeline. And let's look at what it shows. First thing right here is that the defendant arrived at Moselle at 6:42. Now I'll say one thing. You've heard a lot of testimony about what he said about times. What time he got home, what time he went to the office, how long he was at Alameda. Certainly people can have some variability in assessing that. But he almost never was right. Almost never was right. 6:42, he arrives at Moselle. Paul, according to his extraction, gets there about 7:04. And about 7:03, we see the defendant steps registering on his phone. And then, over the next 30 minutes or so, we see a symmetry, general symmetry between the steps between Paul's phone and Alex's phone, as he described, walking the property. At 7:39, we have creation of the Snapchat video that had the clothes on it. When that ultimately was recovered and you saw the interview, it was shown to the defendant, who had provided his clothes that night. And at the first time then he started talking about changing his clothes, and we'll talk more about that later. Again, 7:55 to 8:05, we have some symmetry with the steps. We have Paul Murdaugh's battery life, and you heard from the experts that have reviewed Paul's usage, that like many kids his age, he's constantly flirting with it being low, but that doesn't stop him from using it, and you see that in the evidence in this case as well. 7:56, again, that's when Paul sends the Snapchat to his friends. And then at 8:08, we see Paul leave the kennel area at 8:06, and 8:08 make his way down to the residence. 8:05 to 8:09. Around that time that Paul is getting there at 8:08, that's the last step activity on Alex's phone. And it's the last step activity until 9:02, which we'll talk about in a minute. Alex's phone pretty much goes with no activity for that time period. And also he has no cell activity from 6:52 to 9:04, which is right in that time period we'll talk about in a little bit. So, eating dinner. You heard the defendant talk about eating dinner. Paul is at that residence, if you look right here, from 8:14 down to 8:35. And again, that timeline exhibit, there's a big one and then there's a condensed one. And all of this is in there in evidence for y'all to look at. He's at that residence from 8:14 to 8:35. Now, the defendant, again, despite having a photographic memory, a new photographic memory about things that he told y'all that people are hearing for the first time, still can't remember specific things about Maggie's activities, as to when Maggie arrived, as to what they talked about. He can remember dropping his phone down in the console, but he can't remember things like that. He wants to remember things that help him try to explain to you why he never told the truth about maybe the most important thing he could tell law enforcement. But he can remember very specific details. He still gets this wrong. But she arrives at 8:17 in Moselle. They're already there. How do we know that? Because her cell phone disconnects from her Mercedes at 8:17, and that's when she starts showing steps. And Paul, what's he doing? He's still using his phone like always. We see the battery life, but he's still sending snaps. He's receiving snaps, bless you. He's sending to his friends, all these friends right here. He's receiving these snaps all during that time from 8:17 to 8:30, continuing to communicate with his friends, using his phone like always. And then what happens? About 8:30, Maggie's phone registers some steps. And consistent with that, consistent with her and Paul going down to the kennels, riding down to the kennels, we see Paul's Murdaugh's phone start showing steps. And then down here at 8:38, he's in that kennel area where those dots are. And if you look at that particular slide from 8:38 to 8:44, that's going to be the last GPS reading on Paul's phone, 8:44. You heard from Rogan. And you've heard from Rogan as it references this timeline. And Rogan tells you and told you from that witness stand that he was having a conversation with Paul about cash and the dog's tail. They were having an active conversation about that. Paul calls Rogan at 8:40 and they're talking about it. And Rogan says, send me a FaceTime, but if it doesn't work, send me a video. At 8:44, 4 minutes and 14 seconds, we have right here the FaceTime, but it only lasts 11 seconds. And then at 8:44:55, that's when the kennel video was recorded, that lasts 50 seconds. At the beginning of this investigation, as you'll recall the testimony, they didn't have Paul's password and couldn't get in. And you heard in the defendant's August 11th statement that when he was asked about Rogan saying he may have heard Alec on the phone during this time, he said, well, I'd be surprised if that were the case. Because law enforcement didn't have this kennel video. They didn't have this kennel video until April of 2022, when Paul's phone was finally unlocked. And that changed everything. Why did it change everything? Opportunity. Being at the scene of the crime when the murders occurred. Opportunity. And more importantly, exposing the defendant's lies about the most important thing he could have told law enforcement. When was the last time I saw my wife and child alive?